The cabin lights flickered at 11:23 p.m. as Flight 447 cruised through dark skies over the Atlantic Ocean. Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the cold window, watching lightning dance between clouds in the distance. She was 18 years old, traveling alone to visit her father at a military base in Germany. The plane carried 300 passengers, most of them sleeping peacefully under thin blankets, unaware that their lives would soon depend on a teenager with no flying experience. Sarah had always dreamed of becoming a pilot like her father, spending countless hours in flight simulators and reading aviation manuals, but she never imagined her knowledge would be tested like this. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The first sign of trouble came as a soft gas on the flight attendant rushing past Sarah's seat. Through the gap in the curtain separating economy from business class, Sarah saw the woman's pale face. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the speakers, but his words were slurred and confused. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some, I don't feel... The announcement cut off abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made Sarah's heart pound. Passengers began stirring, murmuring nervously to each other. A child started crying somewhere behind her. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her military training from youth programs kicking in. Stay calm. Assess the situation. Take action. She moved toward the cockpit just as a head flight attendant, Maria, emerged with tears streaming down her face. Both pilots are unconscious, Maria whispered, her voice breaking. Food poisoning, we think. The co-pilot collapsed 10 minutes ago, and the captain just passed out. We're trying to revive them, but... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, but her mind was already racing through possibilities. 300 people. No pilots. A massive aircraft flying on autopilot over the ocean. They had maybe 2 hours of fuel left before they would need to land, and autopilot couldn't do that on its own. I've trained on simulators, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. My father is Colonel James Martinez, a fighter pilot. I've studied aviation my whole life. I'm not saying I can do this perfectly, but I might be our only chance. Maria stared at her like she'd spoken in a foreign language. An 18-year-old girl flying a commercial jet? It sounded insane. But as another flight attendant called out that both pilots still weren't responding to treatment, Maria made a decision that would either save everyone aboard or doom them all. She nodded slowly and led Sarah to the cockpit door. The flight deck was a galaxy of blinking lights, switches, and screens that would have overwhelmed anyone else. But Sarah had memorized cockpit layouts since she was 12 years old. She recognized the altimeter showing 38,000 feet, the airspeed indicator reading 450 knots, the fuel gauges slowly dropping. The captain lay slumped in his seat, breathing but completely unresponsive. The co-pilot was the same. Sarah slid into the captain's chair, her hands trembling as she gripped the controls. Okay, she whispered to herself. You've done this 1,000 times in simulation. This is just a really expensive simulator. But her joke fell flat even to her own ears. This was real. One mistake, and everyone would die. Maria contacted air traffic control, and soon Sarah heard a voice in her headset. Flight 447, this is London Center. We understand you have an emergency situation. Can you confirm that you're a civilian with no official flight training? The controller's voice was professional but tense. Sarah took a deep breath. Confirmed. I'm 18 years old. I've logged about 200 hours on flight simulators and studied aviation extensively. I understand the basics of flight operation. There was a long pause. Then, understood, Flight 447. We're going to get you through this. My name is Captain David Wright, former RAF pilot. I'll be talking you down step by step. First, do not touch anything unless I tell you to. The autopilot is your friend right now. For the next 40 minutes, Captain Wright walked Sarah through every system check, every gauge reading, every switch position. He explained how the aircraft's computer systems worked, how to adjust autopilot, how to communicate with the plane's sophisticated controls. Sarah's military discipline kept her focused even as fear clawed at her chest. She thought about her father, wondering if he knew what was happening. She thought about the mother and baby she'd seen boarding, about the elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, about the businessman who complained about the Wi-Fi, all of them trusting their lives to a girl who'd never actually flown anything real before. "Sarah, we need to prepare for descent," Captain Wright said at 12:51 a.m. The nearest suitable airport is Shannon in Ireland. "Weather conditions are acceptable. Visibility is good. But I need you to understand something." His voice grew heavier. "Landing is the hardest part of flying. Pilots train for years to get it right. I won't lie to you. This will be extremely difficult. But you're doing everything perfectly so far. I believe you can do this." Sarah's hands were slick with sweat. The cabin behind her had gone silent. Maria had told the passengers what was happening, and now 300 people sat in hushed terror, praying for a miracle. The descent began at 1:17 a.m. Sarah's fingers moved across the controls with surprising confidence, adjusting the autopilot settings as Captain Wright instructed. The plane began dropping altitude, smoothly at first, then with slight bumps as they entered thicker air. Sarah's stomach lurched with each movement. Through the windscreen, she could see lights appearing far below like scattered diamonds. Ireland, civilization, safety. But between here and there lay the most dangerous minutes of the flight. "Autopilot will handle most of it," Captain Wright explained. "But the final approach, the last few hundred feet, you'll need to take manual control. I'll guide you through every second." At 1:42 a.m., Shannon Airport's runway lights appeared ahead. Two parallel lines of brilliant white cutting through the darkness. Sarah's heart hammered, so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. The plane was descending fast now, the ground rushing up to meet them. "Speed is good," Captain Wright said. "Altitude is good. You're perfectly lined up with the runway. At 200 feet, I need you to take the controls. Gently, like you're holding something precious and fragile." Sarah's hands moved to the yoke, that strange steering wheel that controlled the massive aircraft. It felt heavy, resistant, alive somehow. The runway was getting closer. Closer. 100 feet. 50 feet. "Pull back slightly," Captain Wright commanded. "Easy. Easy. Hold it steady." The wheels touched down with a screech and a bounce that threw Sarah forward against her seatbelt. The plane lurched, skipped, then settled onto the runway with a second impact that rattled every panel in the cockpit. But they were down. They were on the ground. Sarah's hands flew across the controls exactly as she practiced, deploying the reverse thrusters, applying the brakes, keeping the aircraft straight as it screamed down the runway at terrifying speed. Slower, slower. The end of the runway was approaching fast. Too fast. Sarah pressed the brakes harder, feeling the massive jet shudder and groan. And then, with just 500 feet of runway remaining, Flight 447 came to a complete stop. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before the cabin erupted in cheers, crying, and applause. Sarah sat frozen in the captain's seat, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. Through the cockpit window, she saw emergency vehicles racing toward them, their lights painting the darkness red and blue. Maria burst into the cockpit and wrapped Sarah in a fierce hug, sobbing with relief. "You did it," Maria kept saying. "You actually did it. You saved us all." Sarah finally allowed herself to cry, great shaking sobs that released all the terror and pressure she'd been holding inside. She was 18 years old, and she'd just landed a passenger jet with 300 people aboard. The days that followed were a blur of media interviews, commendations, and attention that made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. Her father flew in from Germany, and when he saw her, he simply held her tight and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." The pilots recovered fully, apologizing endlessly for the food poisoning that had struck them both. The passengers sent letters, gifts, and messages of gratitude. A little girl named Emma drew Sarah a picture of an airplane with hearts around it. But Sarah didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd been terrified out of her mind and somehow gotten lucky. Captain Wright flew to Ireland to meet her in person. He was a gray-haired man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "What you did was extraordinary," he told her over tea at a quiet cafe near the airport. "But do you know what impressed me most? It wasn't your knowledge or your simulator time. It was your composure. You never panicked. You listened. You trusted the process. Those are the qualities of a real pilot. He smiled. Have you considered making this official? I think you found your calling. Sarah looked out the window at the planes taking off and landing, metal birds dancing against clouds. She thought about those terrifying minutes in the cockpit, the weight of 300 lives in her hands, the impossible decision to try something she'd never done before. And she realized something surprising. She would do it again. She would do it 1,000 times if it meant saving people. 6 months later, Sarah began formal flight training at an academy in London, her tuition covered by a scholarship funded by the grateful passengers of Flight 447. On her first day in a real cockpit with an instructor beside her, she felt that familiar mix of fear and excitement. But this time, she knew something she hadn't known before. She knew she was capable of more than she'd ever imagined. She knew that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And she knew that somewhere out there, 300 people were living their lives because an 18-year-old girl had refused to give up. As Sarah lifted off the runway for her first official training flight, she whispered a quiet thank you to whatever force had prepared her for that impossible night. Then she focused on the horizon ahead, ready for whatever came next. The sky was no longer a dream. It was home.